Greetings, class. We're still in Chapter 7, Section 4, but this is Part 2. We're going to look at some of the problems that are written in words rather than just giving you the values like we did in number 4 from page 391. So we're looking at number 9 about smokers. It says a medical researcher says that less than 25% of U.S. adults are smokers. In a random sample of 200 U.S. adults, 19.3% say that they are smokers. At alpha equals 0.05, is there enough evidence to support the researcher's claim? Well, the first sentence gives us the claim. It says a medical researcher says that less than 25% of U.S. adults are smokers. Now, I've had some students that have been having some difficulty with the inequality symbols, and so I thought I might show you that there is a page in your text, page 349, that gives you some verbal statements so that you can match them. In this case, it says the researcher says that less than 25%. So let's look at our chart and if we look at our chart, do you see less than? The only place I see less than, and I know they use a K, but that is for the value. But less than, it says, goes with H of A. H sub A, our alternative hypothesis, goes with less than. And the symbol for H sub A in that case is this inequality, the less than symbol. So this is going to be important that you match up some of these statements with the appropriate inequality. So in our problem number 9 about smokers, less than goes with the alternative hypothesis, less than. Now I realize we're doing population proportions because this is a percent here, but the use of the inequality, you might find that helpful. So let's go to StatCrunch and let's talk about this. We know that the claim was our H sub A, where P is less than 25%, but 25% written as a decimal without the percent sign would be 0.25. And for our null hypothesis, P is greater than or equal to, so that's the complement of our H sub A, and it would be greater than or equal to 0.25. So those are your two statements, and the one that is the claim, and it's important to realize that our alternative hypothesis is the claim. Now what we're supposed to be doing is verifying whether the researcher's claim, whether we have enough evidence to support the researcher's claim. So it says in a random sample of 200 U.S. adults, that means that your N, I'm just going to type it down here, N is equal to 200 because that's your sample size. Let's see if I can move this over a little bit, make it, I don't think that's going to help. 19.3% say that they are smokers. That is your value for P hat. Now I can't put the little hat on top of P, so I'm just going to say P hat equal 19.3%. But I need to write that as a decimal without the percent sign, so that would be 0.193. So that's the P value, the P hat value that we're going to be looking at when we look at the test. And it says alpha is 0.05. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that in my StatCrunch, that alpha equals 0.05. So it's at the 5% level of significance. Now, there are two ways to go about deciding whether we reject H sub O, our null hypothesis, or fail to reject. The two methods are finding a critical z-value and looking for a rejection region. And then the other one is looking at the p-value that goes along with the test statistic. So we're going to go ahead and look at the rejection region. Since our H sub A is less than, we're looking at a left-tailed test. So I go to Stat, I go to Calculator, and I go to Normal. In this case, although it's a proportion, we are using the normal distribution to approximate the population proportion. So if I go to Normal and I do less than at a rate of 0.05 for my alpha, that will give me the critical value, and it says it's negative 1.645. So Z critical, I think in your book they're using Z sub O, but it's the critical value, and it is negative 1.645. And so the rejection region is if your test statistic were anywhere in this red, which is if your Z test statistic were less than negative 1.645. So I'm going to close my graph here. This gave me my rejection region in red here. So there's my rejection region. Now I'm going to run the test. So that was just using the distribution, the standard normal distribution to find my rejection region. Now I'm actually going to run the test to determine the Z test statistic to help me decide whether to reject H sub O or not. So I go to Stat, and this time we do a proportion stats because we're looking at p-values, one sample with a summary. And I have to know the number of successes out of the number of operations. Well, I know that they sampled 200 U.S. adults. So I know that my number of observations is 200. But I also know that the percent was 19.3%. So I've got to figure out what is 19.3%. So I'm going to use my calculator, and I'm going to take 0.193, that's 19.3 written as a decimal without the percent sign, and multiply that by 200, and that is 38.6. So that 38.6 is going to get rounded up to 39. So when I go back to my StatCrunch, the number of successes, it was 38.6, but we said we're going to round it to 39. Now we are doing a hypothesis test for p equal 0.25, and the H sub A, remember, is less than, so we use the less than. And I'm going to store this in the data table so I have that Z test statistic to look at. So here is my Z test statistic. I'm going to copy it. See if I can paste it back over here. And it is negative 1.796. So how does negative 1.796 compare to negative 1.645? Well, we know that negative 1.796 is indeed less than negative 1.645. So that means that we reject H sub O. Now, the other way to look at it is to ask yourself, is the p-value less than or equal to, and I don't have an equal to, but is it less than or equal to alpha? Well, the p-value, if you go back over to your test, so I'm just going to arrow over where that information is, my p-value, and I'm just going to copy it and bring it back over where I was writing. There's my p-value. So if I compare that 0.03, that definitely is less than 0.05. Oops, that's 0.036, so 0.04 is less than, I rounded that to two places, 0.04, that's 6, made the 3 a 4. And so since my answer is yes, the p-value is less than alpha, I know, again, that I reject H sub O. So either way I look at this, whether I look at the rejection region or I look at the p-value compared to alpha, I reject H sub O regardless. Now, this is the one I'm rejecting. I'm actually rejecting H sub O, the null hypothesis. If you reject H sub O, that means you have evidence to support H sub A, your alternative hypothesis, which is the claim. So our actual interpretation of this is that there is enough evidence. I'm going to have to open this up a little bit so you can read the sentences here. There is enough evidence at the 5% level of significance to support the researcher's claim, in this case, H sub A equal P, that less than 25% of U.S. adults are smokers. So we did have enough evidence because we rejected H sub O. Our evidence comes from the fact that our test statistic is in the rejection region. It also comes from the fact that the p-value is less than alpha. And you don't have to do both of those. You either show me with the rejection region or you show me with the p-value. Sometimes my stat lab will tell you that it wants you to use the rejection region because it will ask you what is z sub 0, and then it will ask you what is the test statistic. And that test statistic was the negative 1.796. Other times it will ask you to tell what is the p-value and how does that compare to alpha. So it will ask you to do one or the other, and if it doesn't specify, then you have the option of using either the rejection region or the p-value to determine whether or not you will reject the null hypothesis. So I'm hoping that you're finding this a little helpful with the written notes in StatCrunch along with using the StatCrunch calculators.